Well, thank you very much to my dear friend Frank, who isn't Frank Gaffney such an incredible voice for strength and principle. Speaking the truth takes courage, and that's one thing Frank Gaffney has in large supply. It was interesting. He mentioned that it was a bit of a schlep to get here. It was a bit of a schlep to get back. And I was listening to that. It occurred to me that at least with my colleagues in the Senate, it's a different Yiddish word they use with respect to me. And then he observed that I had acquired a bit of notoriety, celebrity, which worried me even more. I was very afraid this was going into a Justin Bieber comparison. And I would note that Justin Bieber and I both were born in Canada, and again, there are more than a few of my colleagues who wish the both of us would self-deport. So I am glad that Frank did not go down that road. It is great to be with you. Let me thank you for being here. This is a time of enormous threats. This is a time when liberty is imperiled. When U.S. leadership recedes from the world, as we have in the last 5 years, the sphere of influence of Russia expands. The sphere of influence of Iran expands. The sphere of influence of China expands. When there is a vacuum of leadership in the world, it is not a good thing for America, and it is not a good thing for freedom in the world. Beginning with Russia, it's just been publicly reported that Vladimir Putin has been nominated for the 2014 Nobel Peace Prize. I'm not making that up. Now, past recipients like Yasser Arafat may in fact welcome that nomination. But is there any clearer signs that we have gone through the looking glass than people are describing this KGB thug as a candidate for the Nobel Peace Prize? Last September, Putin penned an op-ed in the New York Times in which he cautioned President Obama about encouraging the American people to believe that we are exceptional. According to Putin, American exceptionalism is a dangerous thing. I have to admit, I'm a little bit concerned, given recent events, that President Obama took Putin's words a little bit too much to heart. But I will say this. Putin has a point. It has indeed been dangerous when the American people understand we are exceptional. It has been dangerous to tyrants and dictators throughout the course of history when the American people understand we're exceptional and defend liberty on the global stage. When millions of men, women, and children were being systematically murdered in Nazi concentration camps, Americans fought to end the slaughter, with 405,399 of our greatest generation sacrificing their lives to defeat fascism. When millions of men, women, and children were being brutalized in the Soviet gulags, Americans on both sides of the political aisle rallied together to fight the Cold War. And after decades of struggle, the Iron Curtain crumbled, and 286,730,819 people were freed from the yoke of communism. Both of these efforts, which not coincidentally were entirely in the national security interest of the United States of America, were the two greatest acts of liberation in the history of the planet. That's the legacy of America. Standing up against brutality, against oppression, and calling evil by its name. By contrast, Putin has assessed the fall of the Soviet Union as the, quote, greatest geopolitical catastrophe of the 20th century. Look, at least he's candid. From his perspective, that's right. If you're cheering for the dictators and thugs and tyrants, it was not a good day for oppressing your fellow man. But what a sad statement it is that the President of the United States cannot stand up and counter that narrative. Instead, we see American newscasters covering the Olympics in Sochi describing the collapse of the Soviet Union as bittersweet. What on earth was bittersweet about it? From Washington, the clarity is not there. We all remember the leadership that President Ronald Wilson Reagan provided. When President Reagan came in and observed the undeniable truth that the Soviet Union was an evil empire, he was roundly criticized for saying such impolitic things. When he said Marxism-Leninism would end up on the ash heap of history, that lacked subtlety. It lacked nuance. It didn't take into account that it would be reincarnated in the platform of the DNC. When he was asked his strategy on the Cold War, and he said, "We win, they lose," the foreign policy apparatchiks were aghast. Such simplistic reasoning. Far, far better, they explained, to embrace détente, which I'm pretty sure was French for surrender. And every one of us remembers when President Reagan stood in front of the Brandenburg Gate and uttered the most important words uttered by a leader in modern times, "Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall." Where is that clarity today? Instead, we hear tortured semantics. So from the White House, quote, "kinetic action" is used to glamorize the failed policy of leading from behind in Libya. A, quote, "spontaneous protest" is used to explain the coordinated al-Qaeda attacks that murdered 4 Americans in Benghazi, including the first U.S. ambassador killed in service since 1979. The interim agreement over Iran's nuclear weapons program, described by one of our closest allies as an historic mistake, is in the Obama universe described as, quote, "a display of international unity." And most recently, just last week, the Russian invasion of Ukraine was euphemistically designated by the White House, quote, "an uncontested arrival." These are the words of fools. It has long been said those who fail to learn from history are doomed to repeat it. And not just by junior high history teachers. History teaches that appeasement historically leads to more and more violence. That bullies and tyrants are only encouraged when America uses words that obscure the truth and hides from their aggression. It's been reported that the Russian foreign minister was on the phone with John Kerry, describing there are no Russian troops on the Crimean border. There are no Russian troops going into Ukraine. And it's been reported that our Secretary of State's response was, "Well, I understand, but there are some things that might be misunderstood and misconstrued to suggest that." That conversation was occurring while Russian tanks were rolling into Ukraine. Now, no one should be surprised that the Russians are lying to us. But we should expect some modicum of understanding from our side that the Russians are lying to us. The people of Ukraine have been standing bravely, heroically, in support of freedom. The image of those protesters in Kiev with the blistering cold. We get concerned when it gets a little nippy and there's a little snow on the ground here in Washington. So those protesters stood there bloodied and beaten and tortured and standing strong and saying, "We want to be free. We want to be with the West. We want to be with Europe. We want to be with America. We do not want to be under the domination of Putin and the Russian bear." How different things would have been if we had a president of the United States who spoke to the hopes and dreams and yearning for freedom of the Ukrainians that were standing instead of hiding behind diplomatic babble. We all remember the power of President Reagan's words as he spoke out for freedom, as he stood with Lech Walesa in solidarity in Poland. Natan Sharansky describes how in the gulags they would pass from cell to cell. Did you hear what President Reagan said? Did you hear what he said? Truth has power. And the United States has a responsibility to speak the truth and to stand for freedom. President Obama's statement yesterday about what was going on in international law is frankly so absurd the writers of Saturday Night Live could not have come up with it. He said, quote, "President Putin seems to have a different set of lawyers making a different set of interpretations about international law. But I don't think that's fooling anybody." This is not about how many lawyers can dance on the head of a pin. Who cares? This is about a fight for freedom. This is about a fight between good versus evil. No one thinks that Putin is consulting with lawyers. Although I would note that if we were to send the State Department's lawyers to Russia, that might well constitute a violation of the Geneva Convention. Putin is not agonizing with, "So tell me, Frank, is it legal if we march tanks into a sovereign nation, invade their territory, take them over, and suppress them?" There's not a whole lot of ambiguity there. And yet our president thinks, oh, this is just a different legal interpretation. It's sort of like the mugger who has a different legal interpretation. I think your wallet is mine, you think it's yours. That's not a question of legal interpretations, that's a question of theft and brutality. Let's talk about our military budget. In the midst of the world becoming a more and more dangerous place, we have been visited by leadership from our President and our Secretary of Defense that says the best response to that is dramatically to reduce the size of our Army. In fact, to shrink our Army to pre-World War II levels. The world has only become a more dangerous place, not a less dangerous place. And listen, every one of us would agree there is waste and fraud and abuse at the Pentagon like any large bureaucracy. Any entity that hasn't been audited. There is plenty of room to cut, but I would note that yesterday I had the opportunity to very gently question Secretary Hagel. And I asked him, for example, why the Pentagon is continuing to spend $170 million on algae fuel for the Navy that cost 4 times as much as regular fuel and are instead proposing to cut Army infantry troops. I asked him, why is the Department of Defense spending $7 billion on renewable energy projects, including there was a $14 million wind turbine that was set up in Alaska in a place where there is no wind. It's So they're having to take it down because someone made the radical discovery that you need wind for a wind turbine to work. Why do they continue to pour that money down a rat hole? And rather than cut that waste, they propose cutting the Army's brigade combat teams. How backwards is that? Now, the answers he gave were utterly unsatisfactory. At first, he had to reach for the comptroller and say, I don't know what we're spending on that. Really? Well, maybe he should know what they're spending on that if he's proposing cutting tens of thousands of people from our Army. Before you cut a soldier, let me suggest the Secretary of Defense should get in and say, I want to find out every penny that's being wasted in this building, and I want to take that penny and use it to support the men and women of our military and to defend our national security. Now, the Secretary of Defense did respond by describing these programs as, quote, luxuries. I don't know that algae fuel has ever been considered luxurious. But I'm glad he used that characterization, because he agreed in a time of scarcity this was not a time for luxury. So I am looking forward, consistent with his testimony, for the announcement that they're going to cut these unnecessary luxuries and instead put our resources to the men and women who risk their lives every day to defend this nation. And what's happening in Ukraine mirrors what's happening in Venezuela. In Venezuela, once again, we see people standing up, yearning to be free. We see Maduro's government there using the same brutal, thuggish tactics with support from Iran to murder and torture the protesters. We see Leopoldo Lopez, the opposition leader who organized the protest, thrown in prison. And where is the President of the United States? Why isn't the President of the United States standing up and calling on Maduro, free Leopoldo Lopez today? And it is ironic that in Venezuela the people are suffering so mightily. Because there are few nations on earth that God has so blessed with natural resources as the people of Venezuela. And yet their government abuses those resources, doesn't develop those resources, gives oil for free to Cuba to prop up the tyrant Castro brothers, while the people of Venezuela suffer and live in misery. And I will note that there is an opportunity domestically that opens up an opportunity internationally to transform these debates. And that opportunity is the American energy renaissance that is ongoing right now in America. Now, I will note it didn't come from Washington. It didn't come from a think tank. It didn't come from a government program. It came from hard-scrapple entrepreneurs who revolutionized long-standing technology to discover that we could unlock vast resources that even a few years ago were utterly inaccessible. We are seeing an energy renaissance that is transforming and producing millions of jobs, but it also presents an opportunity. So with Ukraine, people ask, well, are you proposing military action in Ukraine? And listen, no rational person is interested in a shooting war between the United States and Russia. Two massive nations with massive militaries and massive nuclear stockpiles. No one wants to see that devolve into a shooting war. But there are a host of steps we can take that do not involve direct military conflict with Russia. Number one, when the protesters stood up in Kiev, we should have stood with them. We should have spoken unequivocally in their support. Number two, when the Russian tanks entered Ukraine, we should immediately begin working to expel Russia from the G8. If a nation wants to be treated as a member of the civilized community in the world, then it should behave as a member of the civilized community in the world and not use its military to oppress its neighbors. We ought to be enforcing the Magnitsky Act and expanding it to punish those who are violating international law and committing unspeakable human rights atrocities. And energy presents an incredible opportunity. We ought to immediately sign a free trade agreement with Ukraine and work with them to assist building the infrastructure so that they can accept liquid natural gas, the most effective economic blackmail that Russia uses over Ukraine and much of Europe is energy and natural gas in particular. We've got an abundance of natural gas here in America. If we export the liquid natural gas to Ukraine, A, it produces jobs and economic growth here at home, and B, it frees from economic blackmail and the pressure that Russia uses to keep them under their domination. I would finally note what we ought to be doing is reinstalling the anti-ballistic missile defense in Eastern Europe that was supposed to go there. And that President Obama canceled in an effort to appease Putin and Russia. Well, that effort hasn't succeeded. And let me note, look, this is entirely consistent with the tradition of U.S. foreign policy, where we stand vigorously, we use soft power, we use economic power, we use diplomatic power, we use all the tools at our disposal to stand for liberty, to stand with our allies, and to advance our interests. Look, we ought to put the missile defense back anyway, but in response to Putin's aggression, it's all the more attractive. With respect to Venezuela, we ought to pursue, if Venezuela throws off the yoke of its Castro-style dictatorship, we ought to pursue a bilateral investment treaty so that we can work with them in mutually beneficial ways to develop their fantastic energy reserves and make it so the rest of the world sees a clear contrast. You can choose to go down the path of freedom, of economic prosperity, of opportunity that lies with America and the West, or you can choose to live under domination and dictatorial rule. That's a contrast. That's a choice. And let me tell you, every heart on earth yearns to be free. That's what America should be standing for. Let me finally discuss Iran and Israel. Throughout all of this, the single gravest threat to the national security of the United States and to the national security of Israel is the threat of a nuclear Iran. I agree with Prime Minister Netanyahu that this deal with Iran is a very, very bad deal, that it is an historic mistake. And I'll tell you, I fear we are replaying the mistakes of the Clinton administration in the 1990s with North Korea. The 1990s with North Korea, we convinced the international community to lift sanctions. We allowed billions of dollars to flow into North Korea. And they used those billions of dollars to develop nuclear weapons. Now, as dangerous, as foolhardy as that was, Iran is orders of magnitudes worse. Why? Because Kim Jong-il and Kim Jong-un, while radical, while extreme, while unpredictable, nonetheless had a clear and have a clear overarching desire, and that is a megalomaniacal, narcissistic desire to stay in power, to remain dear leader. And both of them understood that if they ever use nuclear weapons, the day they did so would be the last day their regime remained in power, because they would instantly be taken out. And so, as unpredictable and dangerous as that regime is, there is some modicum of rational deterrence that is possible when you've got a clear, distinct interest in self-preservation. Iran, on the other hand, we need to recognize that the supreme leader, that the mullahs there, are governed by a radical, extreme religious obsession that celebrates suicide, that celebrates loss of life in pursuit of jihad that they hold higher. If, God forbid, Iran acquires a nuclear weapon, in my view, the odds are unacceptably high that that weapon would immediately be used and detonated in the skies above Tel Aviv or New York or Los Angeles. And listen, if a nuclear weapon went off in Tel Aviv, it would murder thousands upon thousands of Palestinians. And from what the Iranians have said, they would welcome that loss of life as the sacrifice they would do. When the leaders say their objective is to drive Israel into the sea, to annihilate the Jews in Israel, believe them. In the midst of the negotiation, the Iranian leaders refer to Israelis as, quote, rabid dogs. President Rouhani openly gloats to the world how the United States is succumbing to Iran's interests and that their nuclear program continues unabated. And yet they're celebrating hundreds of millions and billions of dollars that are beginning to flow into Iran. This is a tragic, historic mistake. And I'll tell you, many in this room have also studied the impact of what an EMP would do. What one nuclear weapon detonated in the atmosphere above the eastern seaboard could do, taking out the power grid up and down the Atlantic coast, destroying our ability to distribute food, to distribute the basic necessities of life. It would have the potential to cause literally the deaths of tens of millions of Americans. That's one nuclear weapon detonated above America. That's what the threat is. Now, what should we do instead? What we should do instead is not complicated. Any responsible president of the United States would begin by saying, under no circumstances will the nation of Iran ever be allowed to acquire nuclear weapon capability. And Iran has two options. They will also either stop, disassemble their centrifuges, hand over their enriched uranium, or we will stop them. That is the only language bullies and tyrants have ever respected or learned, is the language of strength. And ironically, what this administration doesn't understand is weakness and appeasement only invites military conflict. No one in this room wants to see military conflict. And let me speak, in wrapping up, to a broader question, and a question of why are we here, why are folks here and not at CPAC? There's a lot of discussion about the differing views in the Republican Party. And are Americans war-weary? Are we war-weary, and as the consequence to that, does that mean that we're no longer willing to defend ourselves? I think that is a profound misreading of the American people. Now listen, I agree with many of the libertarian critics that the job of our military is not to intervene all around the world and to be the policeman for the world. And I'll give an example. In the Republican Party, you can point to 2 points on two ends of the spectrum of where foreign policy views lie. On one side, you have the views of John McCain. On the other end of the spectrum, you have the views of Rand Paul. And I would note, with respect, my views are very much the views of Ronald Reagan, which I would suggest is a third point on the triangle. So let me give a couple of concrete examples to make that real. I agreed with Rand Paul that we should not engage in military conflict in Syria. Now, why is that? Well, look, there's no doubt that Assad is a brutal tyrant who has murdered over 100,000 of his own citizens, who's used chemical weapons to murder children. He is a very, very bad guy. But the enemy of your enemy is not necessarily your friend. And just because he is a brutal tyrant doesn't mean the rebels are any better. And given the deep proliferation of radical Islamic terrorists among the rebels, it was not, in my judgment, in our national security interests to engage in a military conflict and to get us in the middle of a Sunni-Shiite civil war where the United States national security is not benefited. Now, in the course of that, I tried to keep an open mind. I tried very much to give the President, give the administration time to articulate a national security interest, to articulate what is the objective that is thought. In the midst of that, Secretary Kerry very helpfully explained the objective is to use an unbelievably small attack. I'm pretty sure when he said that, even Joe Biden said, that was a dumb thing to say. And looking at that issue, there were one of two outcomes that were possible. One, it was an unbelievably small attack, which was nothing more than a PR statement. Tut, tut, you violated international law. You're no longer welcome in our faculty lounge. That was one option. I don't think the military is in the job of issuing press releases. The other option was that we actually did a major military strike that weakened the Assad regime, that caused it to crumble, and if it crumbled and the result was those chemical weapons falling in the hands of radical Islamic terrorists, that is an even worse outcome for U.S. national security interest than where we are right now. But let me contrast on the other side. I agree with John McCain when it comes to the nation of Iran. And the reason is simple. It all comes back to defending the U.S. national security interest. With Iran, if they acquire a weapon, when Iran describes Israel as the little Satan and America as the great Satan, we have every interest to make sure that they don't acquire the weaponry to murder millions of Americans. And my view, just like President Reagan on foreign policy, is if and when we are called to use military force, we should do so with a clear, defined objective that is directly keyed off of U.S. national security. We should go in with overwhelming force. I think we should get the heck out. I don't think, and I think most Americans don't think, we should be engaged in nation-building, building democratic utopias across the world. That's not the job of our military. The job of our military is to hunt down and kill our enemies. And so there is no doubt the American people are weary of foreign adventurism, of sending our military willy-nilly across the globe. But I think it is a grave misreading of the American people to suggest that we are at all hesitant to stand up and defend the safety of our wives and husbands, of our sons and daughters, of the people of America, to stand up and speak with a clarion voice for freedom. That is what America has done for centuries, and it's what I believe will continue to do for centuries into the future. Thank you.